Hi, everybody, and welcome to this special episode of Prinsights Global. I am so thrilled to be joined again for the second time by the magnificent James Eagle, the visual data strategist. He is incredible, and that name doesn't do justice to everything he actually does, which we will get into if you don't know his work. But importantly, his upcoming book, From Chaos to Clarity: How Data Visualization Can Save the World, is going to be out in less than a month. And James, I really want to get into what's going on with the sort of the push for this book, the sort of pre-response. I pre-ordered a book. I'm really excited to get it because I think in today's world, your work in particular, shining light on dark noise is so incredibly important from a visualization perspective, because sometimes the numbers without the actual visualization don't have the same impact, and certainly not the same clarity to grab the word from your title. So let's get into that. What made you come to this role? Where you're basically the sort of prophet of data visualization in the world.
I mean, this is something that I'm really passionate about. I mean, it's my entire life. It's what wakes me up in the morning. I am. There's a lot of reasons why I'm so passionate about data visualization. But one of the things I think really kind of shaped me and kind of shaped my view um, on this whole area is basically where we are today as a society. So the book, which is out on July 10th, it's about how can data visualization help us as a species survive. So right now there is a lot of change in the world. We are entering a new technological era. We're seeing the rise of various technologies like AI, which are probably going to completely transform the economy we live in right now in ways that we cannot yet imagine. In fact, it already is when you think about it. And it's not just that, there's just so much information and data out there that it's impossible for many people to really understand how this world works anymore. Um, it's become much more confusing, much more clouded. It's difficult to really understand what's true and what's not. In a way, you could argue that AI isn't helping, but I don't necessarily believe that's true. I believe that AI could be part of the solution. But right now, the danger that we are in is that we are, one, going to forget how the world works. And we're going to make poor decisions because we don't really understand the world that we're in. And that poor decision making could potentially be disastrous. Now, I'll give you an example. A poor decision could mean pressing the button and launching a nuclear missile because you don't trust your enemy. Just an example. I'm usually throwing that in because those are the kinds of things that can happen when there's misinformation, bad information floating around. And in a way, because the part of the problem is because we're so saturated in data that we can't really see clearly anymore. We can't really see what's real and what's not. And that's basically why I believe we need data visualization. We need data visualization so that we can see clearly, to be able to, in our own human way, try and comprehend the world we live in. And so that is really what drives me, coming from the industry I'm in. So I originally worked in the asset management industry, or the investment industry. And one of the preoccupations I've had throughout my career is risk, because investing is all about risk. It's about taking on the risks that may reward and ignoring those risks that might not, and understanding risk. And now that may sound strange, but generally speaking, we're really bad as a human species in terms of understanding risk. It's not in our DNA to statistically calculate the risks of what we're exposed to. We are a product of our evolution. We often underestimate risks, and we also forget that there are some risks that we just don't know that are out there, the unknown unknowns or the black swan events. Or there are risks that we know about, but we don't actually predict or calculate or prepare for them very well. And the more data saturation, the more data pollution that you get, the greater the risks, because you become less aware of the risks around you. You become less aware of the environment you live in. And in a way that really worries me, because we talk so much about climate change. We talk so much about carbon emissions and how it will damage our planet and could heat up our atmosphere and cause all these problems. But we never talk about something that is potentially even more riskier to us, and that's data pollution. Data pollution could potentially wipe us out because, well, as I said, we may not see those problems or risks coming. And so a great part of my book is about trying to talk about those risks and how data visualization can be the solution behind that, and how we should try to use technologies like AI to try and really understand the risks that we face. The other thing also is that I try to challenge the way that we look and think about data and charts and graphs, because I think the problem is that we tend to also take an overly scientific approach to data. So you'll see that I don't necessarily believe that data is an exact science. So, and that's a kind of a subtle hint to data science. For me, all data is inherently biased. So data can change. The data may have a certain meaning one day and change the next. And a classic example, I don't know, if we take inflation, for example, we can use that. Inflation back in the 1970s is not the same as inflation today. And the reason being is because the economy that we live in today is structurally very different from what it was in the 1970s. In the 1970s, the US was not a major exporter of oil. It was very dependent on oil from the Middle East, which is why we got hit very hard when OPEC decided to drive up oil prices back then, which was a big driver of inflation. Today, the US is the largest exporter or producer of oil in the world, and it's effectively energy independent. And what's driving inflation, the factors that drive inflation are very, very different. The US is also a much more technologically advanced economy. It is probably the most technologically advanced economy in the world. And it's a very, very different country from what it was 30, 40 years ago. And so when you look at an inflation measure, you wonder, okay, I understand there's a basket of goods measuring the general rise in prices, but really what drives our economy is very, very different. And so the way that we measure inflation might not be accurate. So data is always inherently biased. You can never fully put your finger on it. There's always going to be something that it's never going to be a perfect fit. But as a human being, we need to understand it. We need to be able to understand and interpret in our own human way how the world works. And that means that we need to tell stories. We need to communicate. We need to think about visual imagery. We need to, I mean, if you look at the work that I do when I create a data visualization, it's not just about presenting data. I want to tell a story. I want to make it, I want to be able to communicate with the world and tell the story. And I'll use music, I'll use color, I'll use graphics. And yes, I will try my very best to avoid chart junk. At the same time, I believe that we have to also remember that we're human beings, and we need to be able to be creative, and we need to communicate in the way that we feel gets our points across. So for me, data visualization is not just an analytical tool, it's a communication tool that allows us to see the world, and the world that we've kind of gone out of touch with.
Yeah. No, what's so incredible about your work, and you've just touched on so many really key things that are important for everyone to know, is that you do narrate what is happening. You're not just throwing out data, not just throwing out charts, as you just said. You're adding music. You had this fantastic visualization with music, I think, just recently on the U.S. Treasury debt and other things that you do that really help people to kind of connect to your work. So what's really fascinating about how you do what you do and all the experience that you bring to it is your ability to tell those stories and to get people to really come into this data world both to assess risk and to understand all these topics that you cover. And you do cover a lot. You just talked about AI, and I remember the last time we were chatting about 4 months ago. China had just sort of launched this idea of DeepSeek, and it impacted the Nvidia stock. And we had this conversation because you actually had looked into it, and you weren't so convinced that it was going to sort of change everything that was happening in U.S. stock. Here we are. Nvidia is probably back to where it was before we had that conversation, and the world is sort of assessed, absorbed, and moved on. And you were very spot on at kind of recognizing those patterns from the information that you gather and the insight that you have. And I think you bring this to so many topics. You do a lot on everything. But maybe to get a little bit more into energy, just in terms of the recent work you've done, because right now, we're just at the cusp of more tension in the Middle East, more conversation coming out of OPEC. Yes, the U.S. being a net energy exporter, at least in oil and natural gas. How do you see what you're looking at in terms of the charts and what's actually going to happen in the world around this on
I
these
mean,
topics?
it's a little bit early to say at the moment, but and this is my feeling, this is not me looking at data, but I believe that the US is in a very different position than what it was in the past. It is a huge producer of energy. And a lot of that has been driven by innovation. So if you look at the United States, you look at the shale revolution, and you look at how the country has adapted very effectively to what was previously a threat to its national security, it's quite impressive. And this covers multiple administrations. This was a bipartisan effort. The United States has basically made itself energy independent and protected its economy and protected itself from those types of external shocks that hurt it quite badly in the past. So it's quite incredible, to be honest with you. But I think also we have to bear in mind the role of hydrocarbons in the future is going to change. So we may not necessarily be using hydrocarbons to make energy. We may still be using it to create plastics and all other things. I don't necessarily think demand for oil will ever fade away. But at the same time, our relationship with oil and the way it's used will change. The real war zone and battlegrounds will not necessarily be based on hydrocarbons. They may, however, be based on microprocessors. So if you think about it right now, TSMC, got that right? They're the biggest manufacturer of small 5 nanometer and below processors in the world. Now, those processors, microprocessors, are powering everything from your smartphone to your MacBooks. The United States is incredibly reliant, or Apple and many other technology companies that are based in the US are very, very reliant on those microprocessors. And we're not just talking about consumables, we're talking about everything from graphics cards to the AI infrastructure that we're trying to build globally. And that makes the US very vulnerable. China invades Taiwan, or if China innovates and tries to emulate that kind of technology, realistically, the US doesn't really have the capital to replicate decades of R&D that Taiwan has gone through to create those chips in the mainland, despite multiple administrations attempting to coerce that type of innovation on US soil. So you don't think that the United States will be able to manufacture that level of precision in terms of microprocessor technology anytime soon. And so, that's really where the flashpoint is. So if you look at the data, I think that is where the risk lies. It's not necessarily with oil. It's not necessarily with Iran and Israel having a war. I think it's much it's more the real risk really lies with China and China's kind of keenness to emerge as a world superpower. This is a much bigger strategic threat to the United States. The Middle East is probably less relevant now.
Yeah, so we basically moved from, and you could say the same about any type of, whether it's uranium or rare earths or whatever is used in industrialization, silver, copper, and so forth, that the risk is more in processing, right? It's sort of more midstream than actually the resources themselves. And you know, we have oil, we don't necessarily have rare earths, but that processing strategy that China has had and is growing. Do you see that as a risk to the U.S. And how do you see that as also, or do you see that as
But yeah,
regulating the world? You know, in terms of how partnerships arise going forward based on what you're seeing.
I mean, the rare earths is a complicated debate because it's actually really hard to refine and process rare earths. So it's even for China, there are challenges. And yes, the moment China dominates that market, partly because it has been the manufacturer of the world for a long time, and it's had to get hold of those rare earths. So I think that there's a lot of, I mean, I'm not going to say too much because even I am not comfortable talking about rare earths. I find it incredibly bewildering. It confuses me. If you ask me to talk about lithium, I can talk about lithium. If you ask me to talk about cobalt, I'll talk about cobalt. I'll talk about all these other very important kind of minerals that are important to electrifying the world and building an EV industry, or making the next, changing battery chemistry so you can build iPhones that can, you only have to charge once. I'm happy to talk about that, but rare earths, they confuse me, and it's not an area that I'm really familiar with. But I would say though that there has been a lot of complacency on those kind of supply chain issues. So when Tesla was booming, investors were kind of looking at the cars, and not thinking about what's powering those cars. Where does Tesla get cobalt from? The DRC. 90% or 80% of all cobalt comes from the DRC. Where does the lithium come from? The lithium brine, it comes from Chile, or it can also come from hard rock in Australia. Those supply chains are very vulnerable, and any disruption to those supply chains can have a huge impact on the success of the world electrifying and going green. No one ever thinks about that. They don't think about what the amount of copper is needed to build a wind turbine. And I think there's been a little bit of complacency on the investor side in terms of how we acquire those minerals, and how valuable and how important they are to reaching those strategic goals. That it's all very well ticking boxes and signing agreements to cut carbon emissions, but you need the innovation to get there. And this is the problem. Politicians can sign agreements and make deals, but actually making things happen involves smart, intelligent people, innovation, scientists, and a lot of investment.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that actually is going to be unfolding, yeah, for the foreseeable future, and how ultimately that all manifests, and where investors pop into the equation. You're talking before about inflation and how sort of today's inflation isn't necessarily the same as it was with respect to energy, but also you've had graphs out recently about even eating habits, and you said what people are doing and where they're doing it, how they're doing it, which I think hits home with a lot of people, because individually, whatever the big numbers are in inflation, you break them down a lot to show what things cost, where things cost, and how they impact the consumer at the end of the day. And I wonder if you have some favorite charts on that to share, because they really crystallize what's actually happening beneath those, sort of big, yeah, headline numbers.
I think the reason why I do that, though, it's a lot of the time. So, like, for example, um, data relating to food. The reason why I try to cover that is that it's partly because these are things that people are worried about right now. So this is not just isolated to the United States. All around the world, people are feeling the pinch. Ordinary people. Food prices are rising, and well, they had risen quite considerably, especially in the post-COVID environment. And the thing about inflation is that even though inflation may fall, so for example, it falls back to 2%, for the ordinary person, that means nothing, because when inflation falls, it doesn't mean that prices are getting cheaper. It just means they're rising less fast. For prices to fall, you need deflation. and that's 100% not the environment we're in. So for a lot of ordinary people, they are still feeling pinch. They're feeling, and this is not necessarily a point that I'm trying to attach to people who are struggling financially. This affects even those who are relatively wealthy. Um, Food is more expensive, and that is an emotionally more painful experience that we have to go through. Like whether it is eating in a restaurant or just trying to do your groceries so that you can feed your family. And part of the reason why I do that is because I feel that there's a need to communicate on those topics that matter to people. So if you look at the types of topics I cover, like my last post was on US healthcare, on the exorbitant amount of money US healthcare costs. I live in Switzerland, one of the most expensive countries on the planet, and our healthcare is cheaper than the United States, and it's probably better, to be honest with you, in terms of the service we get over here. And that's shocking. That really surprises me. What is happening? And these, it's not that I'm trying to say that there's a problem. What I'm trying to say is that these are things that people feel emotional about, and they want clarity. They want to know. They want to see the bigger picture. They want to see the problems, or at least try to conceptualize them. So that's part of the reason why I will talk about food and eating, and they may not be directly related to economics or finance, but there are things that matter to people emotionally, and that ties into my whole philosophy of why data visualization is so important as a communication tool. So if you look throughout the history of time, we've gone through waves of innovation when it comes to information. So if we go back to the Babylonian period, the first ever map, or not the first ever map, I don't know what the first ever map was, no one knows, but the oldest map ever discovered was something called the Imago Mundi, which was discovered in Iraq in the 1800s sometime. I can't remember the exact date exactly, but it basically showed a map of the Babylonian period and how cities were kind of interlinked in all those thousands of years ago. And the reason why it was so significant is because, one, maps are not they're abstract kind of images. Like the world isn't flat, and the world is not made of lines. There are no borders when you look from space on planet Earth. And yet, as human beings, we need to create those kind of mental images. We need to create that kind of like orientation, and we need to draw lines. And the reason why that was so significant was because at the time, agriculture had been discovered. The first societies were being formed, the first civilizations were being formed, and as a result, the first economies were being created. So, and when the first economies became created, when different civilizations started to trade with each other, the world became a lot more complex, and so we needed a map at the time to try and understand it. And those maps were beautifully decorated. They were pieces of art. They weren't just simple systems kind of diagrams. They were more than that. They revealed a lot about ourselves, about the people at the time, and who we were as human beings trying to understand the world. Now, if you fast forward further, we started to write as well. Like before, in the past, storytelling was our main way of communicating. They call it the oral tradition. So we told stories at the campfire, and those stories would be passed on from generation to generation. That was, for thousands and thousands of years, our way of communicating information. We drew cave paintings. Cave paintings are probably the earliest form of data visualization that we actually recorded on a rock to transmit information. But for a lot of the time, we were just talking and communicating through words. But as things, our collective memory couldn't quite cope with the amount of information and stories out there, we started to write them down, and that's where we got the written word. And the written word massively enhanced our language, made it much richer, much more interesting, and allowed us to preserve and record information collectively for the whole of society to enjoy. Now, this probably happened before the Imago Mundi or just after, but after the maps and the written word, which is a form of not so much data visualization In some ways it is, because when you read words, you see images. So it is a way of visualizing data. But the real kind of explosion in data happened when they invented the printing press, when the Bible was first printed. Suddenly, I mean, that had a profound impact on society, because suddenly the feudal structures and the control of information that the medieval church once had over society fell apart. People could think for themselves. They could discover and read and learn about their own religious beliefs and science and everything else that was out there. And then we had the internet, again, an explosion of information that gave us access to things that we never had access to before. Information became a lot cheaper to access. And now again, we're seeing it again with the rise of AI, with the rise of chatbots, and LLMs. And, now we have unprecedented access to information. But the problem is, the more information there is, the harder it gets to handle. So the more confusing it is. So we need to continuously innovate in order to try and make sense of the world. And I think one of those innovations, my belief is that we need to use all the tools to our advantage to try and understand the world. And that means not being afraid to share our human emotions, not being afraid to tell stories, not forgetting our humanity, but at the same time, not looking at things like AI as a potential threat, but as part of a solution to help us discover ourselves. And visualizing data, listening to music, using color, and seeing beautiful images that are created by data is part of that process. Not being overly too scientific about it, but just really immersing ourselves and trying to use it as a way to understand the world and also communicate with each other, how the world works. And that's why, for me, one of the biggest frustrations I have is that I would love people to do what I do. Like it's something that frustrates me. Like, people say, wow, that data visualization you produce is beautiful. It's okay, but I wish you could do what I did as well. I wish the technology was there so that you could just do that without. I mean, I feel flattered that you like my work, but coding in JavaScript, messing around with Python, and all those things is fun. But I wish people could do it themselves as well, have access to do it. And it, maybe part of the solution is AI. AI isn't quite there yet, but I think that we need better technology. And I think that's something that I hope we get in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you are incredible. I just want to say to everyone watching or listening here right now that James Eagle's Substack is killer charts, and they are. I am a subscriber. I'm a subscriber to your paid content, James, and I look forward to everything that drops into my inbox. And I got to say, there's a lot of noise there, but I do get clarity from your charts, and I think what your charts do, and it's so lovely that you want other people to be able to do what you do, and perhaps as you said, AI and data quality will advance to be able to do that. But right now, you really are a leader in the world of, as you say, connecting communication with visualization, and data with all of the available tools that you utilize and that you work with so diligently. And I just want to say thank you for your contribution to the actual world, through killer charts, through continuing to look at the data and dissect it and use it to tell stories and make it clear, and make it accurate. And again, everyone, I want to say his book is coming out. I pre-ordered it, From Chaos to Clarity: How Data Visualization Can Save the World. We have his image up here now, and we will have a link. And James, before I let you go, and honestly, the conversations with you just go by so quickly for me. And I appreciate you. I appreciate your time and your work. Can you give maybe like 3 takeaways? And you have said a lot, but maybe just summarize that you can tell listeners and watchers here today about what you want them to get out of your work, and perhaps where they might look to invest, or for future trends that they can leverage right now.
Well, I mean, in terms of 3 takeaways, I think the biggest takeaway is that I'm not sitting still. I'm helping launch a data visualization platform called Plotset, which should allow you and anyone to be able to do what I do with your own data. In fact, it's even more than that. Like you can literally take out a smartphone if you wanted to, and say, for example, you're sitting in a presentation and you see a fantastic chart on screen on stage. You can take a picture, with an iPhone or an Android, upload it, and the platform or the AI or the algorithm will turn that into real data by analyzing a chart in the same way that I do. So I often write code that interprets images that I take like I can take pictures of of charts in newspapers and turn that to data, and then give you the data set that you need. And if you've already got your kind of brand guidelines, the colors that you love and the design that you like, you press a button and it creates a chart in any way that you like, whether it is an animated chart, an interactive chart that you can run your mouse over and analyze, or just a static chart that you can paste into another presentation. So this is something that's coming. So that's one takeaway. So please bear with me on that. It's coming. The other thing, what I would say also is that never forget the importance of storytelling. It is the oldest form of human communication that we have. And a big part of why my data visualizations are successful and go viral is because I'm storytelling. I'm thinking about the emotions that people feel before I press the button to publish. That's really important, because if you want to talk to people, you need to understand people. You need to understand how they feel about the world they're in right now. And part of that is being able to feel what they feel and then try to bring them that information to help address those feelings. So like the last piece I did, rising healthcare costs. How can I try and bring some clarity into their lives and make their lives a little bit more useful, or make them feel better, or give them a greater understanding of the challenges they face? It's really important. And it also helps debunk a lot of the false information that's floating around, especially on social media channels, unchecked, unaudited. There's so much of it out there. It's so important that we do these, that we use data visualization to bring more clarity into the world. And my final takeaway would be also it, there is a process, right, for data visualization. It's not like you just see you create a chart. Part of the enjoyment that I love is the whole exploration process of finding data. Data's so easy to get now. So you can grab data from anywhere. I just told you, you can even grab it with a picture on your iPhone. You can even grab it from, like, we're also building capabilities to be able to read through huge amounts of text and turn that into data that you can turn into charts. So we're using all kinds of all the technology that we can think of to try and bring data visualization to life, and easy for ordinary people to do. So we want to democratize data visualization. But the most important part is the discovery process. So once you have all that data, the enjoyable part is trying to explore, like Indiana Jones, go out there and try and find those stories, find those things that are amazing, that will make the people in your lives go, wow, I didn't realize that. That just brings extra clarity into my world right now. I understand the world a little bit better, because I think that collectively, if everybody on Earth understood the world a little bit better with the data that's out there, I think the world would be a safer and happier place.
No, I agree. I every time I talk to you, you're creating something new, which is one of the other brilliant things about you, James. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time to come here today. Everyone, if you haven't checked it out, James Eagle's Substack Killer Charts is phenomenal. You should. And his new book coming out, From Chaos to Clarity: How Data Visualization Saved the World, is available for pre-order. It is coming out on July 10th. And James, again,
Plotset.com. So
huh?
don't forget to go to plotset.com. It's up
And
live, so you can see it.
and go to plotset.com, which we will have linked here as well. Thank you, James, for noting that as well. And again, I wish you luck with all of these endeavors, and I thank you for everything that you do and for coming on here today. Thank
And
you.
thank you very much.